Alright guys, in today's Show Me we're going to talk about the endocrine system. This is the last chapter for AP1, so everybody give yourself a pat on the back. Then we are finally at the last chapter of the text. So what is the endocrine system and what does it do? So as you might know, the endocrine system deals with hormones. So hormones are going to be an important chemical. So what are hormones? Hormones are chemical messengers. Okay, and these chemical messengers are important because they will make changes around the body. So what other body system did we talk about that makes changes throughout the body? It has connections and it communicates with body tissues. So that would be the nervous system. So there are similarities between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Okay, so let's recount some of these similarities or differences. Okay, the nervous system obviously acts via nerves. And do these things act quickly or slowly? So these are rather quick changes. So as we know, neurons fire. Even the ones that are non-myelinated still fire pretty rapidly. Okay, with endocrine system, they work via hormones. And these are slower, typically. And so they could act immediately, or you could see a delay of hours, or even sometimes days. And hormones travel via blood. So hormones have to be delivered via the bloodstream, whereas, as we know, neurons have their own method of travel, and that's via a neuron. So we say that hormones obviously travel via blood. It's important to mention the concept of target cells. So a hormone, say, that's released by the pituitary gland, an important one that we'll talk about is FSH. FSH is a hormone that will act on the gonads. So think about it. If the hormone is released all the way up in the pituitary gland, it has to travel down to the gonads via the bloodstream. And is it going to pass other tissues along the way? Yes. Think about the fact that the hormone FSH was released into the bloodstream. It's going to travel all around the body, hitting all kinds of tissues, but it's only going to act on the one cell that has the receptor, and that's called the target cell receptor. So we see that different hormones can be found all over the body in the bloodstream, but they only act on a target cell. So here are the major endocrine glands of the body. So up here we have the pineal, in the brain. Can't really tell, but up here that we have two important places. It's going to be the hypothalamus, and then what sits directly under the hypothalamus? Pituitary. Okay, moving down here we have the thyroid, and also the parathyroid glands. Okay, then we have the thymus. Okay, moving down here we have the pancreas. And on top of the kidneys, the adrenal. And then moving down to the pelvic region, we have the ovary and the testes. And these are obviously going to be determined by your sex. So these are the major glands of the body, hormone-wise. You need to make sure you know these. There will be a picture on the final exam that tests your knowledge of the location of these glands. So the first set that we're going to talk about is the hypothalamus/pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is broken down into two parts. So if you look, it has like two, kind of sits and it hangs down, and it has two specific parts. So it has an anterior side and a posterior side. With the posterior side, which is what we'll cover first, there are two hormones you need to be familiar with: oxytocin and ADH. Okay, oxytocin and ADH. Oxytocin is an important hormone for two reasons. One, for childbirth, and number 2 for milk ejection. So obviously both of these are going to be important for females. So with childbirth, what happens with oxytocin is that it's secreted by the posterior pituitary gland. It goes down and it acts on the uterus / cervix, and it acts in response initially to the child causing distension of the cervix. So we call this dilation. So when the cervix becomes slightly dilated, it responds by connecting back via the nervous system with the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus realizes what's going on, releases more oxytocin via the posterior pituitary, which then causes the cervix to become more dilated and causing the uterus to contract. So we see that this is actually a positive, one of the few places we see a positive feedback cycle in the body. And that is going to enhance the initial signal. Remember, positive feedback enhances or exaggerates the initial stimulus until the ultimate goal is achieved, which is the birth of the child. Okay, the number 2, milk ejection, is going to be via oxytocin as well. So when the nipple is stimulated, it causes oxytocin to be released, and that will cause the breast tissue to eject the milk from its storage in the mammary glands. Okay, the second hormone produced by the posterior pituitary gland is ADH. That's anti-diuretic hormone. If you're familiar with what a diuretic is, a diuretic causes the body to release water in the form of urination. So if anti-diuretic hormone is present, that causes the kidneys to reabsorb water in order to retain it. So it's to prevent us from becoming dehydrated. An imbalance related to ADH is called diabetes insipidus. So when we have a problem maybe with our pituitary gland, a tumor or a lesion or some sort, it can cause ADH to be inhibited. So when ADH is inhibited, that causes us to release more water, a lot more water. So what will that lead to then? That will lead to dehydration. So these people who have diabetes insipidus are constantly dehydrated, they're constantly thirsty, and they have to really watch their water balance. So one thing I want to point out, though, is that this diabetes, you guys have heard of diabetes mellitus. That's the one that deals with insulin. This condition has nothing to do with sugar. Diabetes is actually, if you look at the root of the word diabetes, it means siphon. Siphon is when you stick a tube in something and water comes out. So it's literally this person is walking around urinating. That's what happens with both diabetes insipidus and diabetes mellitus. Okay, insipidus, the root of this word, just typically means thirsty. So that's where you break down the words and to their Greek origins, and that's what we see. With the anterior pituitary, it produces 6, count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 important hormones. The way I always remembered this was that the posterior is only in charge of 2. Remember those 2, oxytocin and ADH. Anything else that you see is going to be anterior pituitary related. So anterior pituitary gland produces growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and prolactin. So growth hormone is important because it will regulate our metabolism and also have an indirect effect causing skeletal muscle and bone growth. TSH is also an important regulator of metabolism, okay, via the thyroid gland. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, is in charge of producing our gametes, so our egg and our sperm cells. Luteinizing hormone is important for producing our sex hormones. And adrenocorticotropic hormone responds from the anterior pituitary by acting on the adrenal glands. So we'll talk about a few of the important hormones down there. And then prolactin also acts on the breast tissue. So we saw oxytocin was important, but prolactin responds by producing milk. So prolactin produces the milk whereas oxytocin stimulates the release or the ejection of it. Okay, so what you guys need to do, and this is going to be on your own, is you need to look through both the book and the PowerPoint and look at all these hormones, and if it states that there's a hyper or a hyposecretion of the two of them, okay, you need to look at what those conditions are. So for instance, growth hormone hypersecretion in an adult would cause a condition called acromegaly, but if you have hypersecretion of growth hormone as a child, it would result in gigantism. So there will be a few questions on your final exam regarding imbalances of hormones and how they affect the body. Okay, so the thyroid and the parathyroid glands are important. The thyroid gland secretes three hormones. Two of them, T3 and T4, are important for metabolic purposes in the body. So T3 and T4 they regulate iodine, which you'll see if you look through the book. T4 is the technical name for T4 is thyroxine, and for T3 is triiodothyronine, and they both are metabolic hormones. Calcitonin, on the other hand, as given the name derived from the word calcium, is important because it will inhibit osteoclast. So if they're turning off osteoclast, that will then cause the blood calcium levels to decrease. So think about it. They're turning off the ones that break down bone. So if it's breaking down bone, it's going to release more calcium into the body. If it's inhibiting it, then it will in effect lower it. So we see the opposite effect with PTH. So parathyroid gland secretes a hormone called parathyroid hormone, and it's going to be an antagonist to calcitonin. So it will stimulate osteoclasts, which will then increase blood calcium levels. Again, like we said with the pituitary, make sure you go back and look at these specific diseases. Graves' disease, which is a hypersecretion, and myxedema and cretinism, which are both hyposecretions, and just look at a few of the signs and symptoms that go along with those diseases. Imbalances for thyroid gland. So the next gland moving down is the adrenal. Adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys. They actually are two different glands really built into one. So the cortex, which is the outer layer, has three layers of tissue that synthesize and secrete different hormones, whereas the medulla on the inside is more of a nervous tissue, part of the sympathetic nervous system. If you look at the cortex, it has three different layers. So the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. These are detailed in your text, and each one of these is in charge of producing three different classes of corticosteroids. And if you look through, like I said, the chart in your book, you can see the actions of each of these different secretions. Looking at the hyper and hyposecretions for the cortex, these are important because they are seen in practice somewhat frequently. So you have hyper and hyposecretion. Hypersecretion is called Cushing's syndrome or disease. Different signs or symptoms can happen with this and different causes, but the telltale sign of it is that the person will develop this fatty growth of tissue on their upper thoracic region. Someone named it back in the day buffalo hump, which I think is a terrible name, but that's what it was called. And so treatment of it is usually removal of the tumor, which is the cause of this condition, or obviously medical interventions. With hyposecretion, it's called Addison's disease. So a lot of these diseases are named for the doctors who discovered them. So hyposecretion, which is the opposite effect, has signs and symptoms of weight loss, dehydration, and hypotension. Now with the adrenal medulla, we said that it was important for the sympathetic nervous system, so it's part of the ANS. So with its stimulation, you will see epinephrine and norepinephrine effects, such as vasoconstriction, increased heart rate, blood glucose levels. So these things are part of our fight or flight. So you might have heard of adrenaline. This is where, so the adrenaline hormones come from the medulla region of the adrenal gland. So the pineal gland is important for really one purpose, endocrine-wise, and that's to secrete melatonin. So as you might remember, melatonin is important for regulating our sleep-wake cycle, establishing our circadian rhythm, but it's also important for sexual maturation and the onset of puberty. Okay, so remember that the pineal gland is located in the brain on the back side near the thalamus, on the posterior side of the thalamus near the third ventricle. Small little gland in charge of secreting melatonin. Pancreas is an important gland for regulation of our blood sugar, blood glucose levels. So insulin is produced by the beta cells of our pancreas, whereas glucagon is secreted by the alpha cells. And this has been a test question before, so I need you guys to remember this. And I remembered it this way, that the alpha is produced by the glucagon, so the two A's go together. So when we look at each of these specifically, insulin is going to be released when we have high blood glucose. So we have increased blood glucose levels. Maybe we ate a meal high in glucose. So when we eat the meal that's high in blood glucose, it's causing blood glucose levels to be high, I should say. Okay, insulin is released. And when insulin is released, it then lowers the blood glucose levels by taking the glucose in the blood into our body cells. If we already have enough glucose in our body cells, then insulin will respond by causing the glucose to be stored in certain tissues in our body, such as maybe in glycogen, or by converting it over to fat. Okay, so glucagon then has the opposite effect. So when we have low blood glucose levels, okay, glucagon will be released, and that will cause an increase in blood glucose. So that will cause all of our storage of glucose, such as in glycogen and fat, to be converted or to be released so that we can have proper blood glucose. So these two, insulin and glucagon, these two hormones are antagonistic, so they do the opposite effect, and they're dynamic, so one's always going up, the other's going down, and vice versa. So now with diabetes mellitus. Diabetes mellitus is an insulin-related disorder. There's two types, type 1 and type 2. Okay, so type 1 diabetes means that you are not secreting insulin properly, so it's under secretion of insulin. Okay, type 2 diabetes, you have a proper secretion of insulin, but you have insulin receptors, okay, that are faulty. So basically what happens with this type of diabetes is that there is proper amounts of insulin, but it cannot be detected by the cells, and therefore the cells do not intake glucose properly. So with both of these, type 1 and type 2, it results in high blood glucose levels. The blood glucose levels cannot be reduced. Therefore, the person has different types of signs and symptoms. One of them is that they feel nauseated. Sends you into sympathetic stimulation, and one of the telltale signs of this is glucose in the urine. So when the person takes a urine test, there will be glucose found in the urine. There are signs and symptoms of each of these too. Polyuria, which is where we get remember the diabetes means siphoning. So always urinating. They're also thirsty, just like the other one, but it's for a different reason. And polyphagia, which means that they are hungry. So excessive hunger, because the cells cannot take in glucose properly. So the cells are literally starving. So there is a excessive hunger and food consumption for this reason. Usually these people are not thin. Usually obesity goes along with diabetes mellitus, and it's usually type 2 diabetes. Typically you see type 1 diabetes is more of a child diabetes, whereas 2 is an adult. Now this is not always the case, but that is, when you look at statistics, that is typically what happens. So looking at the gonads, so the testes and the ovaries, we see that, first of all, there's an important hormone called GnRH that's released by the hypothalamus, which then goes down and acts on the pituitary, and that will then cause the release of the FSH, okay, and LH. So FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, stimulates the gamete production, so sperm or egg, whereas LH stimulates the production of the sex hormones. So we have testosterone for males, estrogen, and progesterone for females. Those are secreted over by the ovaries. Okay guys, so this is just a basic review of the endocrine system. I hope that you guys study well for the final, and I hope to see some of you in AP2 either over the summer or in the fall semester.